Hey everyone, welcome back. This is a special edition of Ask GN where we're focusing entirely on cooler questions that were in the cooler orientation content we did. We're doing this video because of a few reasons. There were a lot of questions about things like cavitation that we didn't cover in the video, so we'll be talking about that today. Also, there was an excessive amount of panic about the orientation of the coolers to the extent that people were like, thought it was going to burst into flames if they didn't flip their cooler around right away. And that's not the case. So we need to kind of bring everyone back to earth on the level of severity of the two different issues, which were front mounted with the tubes up, which is, again, primarily an acoustic thing first and foremost, and then later on has some potential performance and permeation considerations to think about. And then the other one was the pump at the top of the loop, which has a more immediate pump or cooler overall will eventually experience more extreme performance issues and eventually likely die out. So we're going to be recapping some of the content because there was like too much panic where I was trying to figure out why, like where was the message lost on some of this stuff. And it seems like they sort of merged into the TLDRs that were written in our comment section, on Reddit, on forums I checked, where the TLDRs that were posted were leaving out about half an hour of information that provided important nuance. So we're going to recap everything today and talk more about that. Before that, this video is brought to you by Team Group and its new Vulkan SSD. The Team Vulkan is available from 250 gigabytes up to 1 terabyte, with the 1 terabyte drives now priced at only around $100. The Team Vulkan is a simple blackout design that focuses on a mix of performance and value for DIY PC builds. Solid-state storage has gotten affordable, so learn more at the link in the description below. Oh, and they're also doing a Never Too Much RGB giveaway that will link below as well. All right, so first of all, as always, in Ask GNs, we take questions from the community. For this one, we've sort of taken the aggregate. We might not show the exact screenshot of the question, but we're going to show a few of them, and then otherwise it's aggregate of common questions we've seen sort of summarized in the way that will most directly deliver the message. If you want the bonus episode of Ask GN, as always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus, where we publish a bonus episode for those people, but those won't be talking about the cooler thing. First thing I want to say before, and I'll cover this again a little bit later as a reminder, is stop harassing YouTubers. That, like I said that in the video, we said this isn't like a going after YouTubers thing. It was really more talking about just manufacturers and how they depicted the product and education in general. And it's just stop. Don't do that. That's not really the intent of the content. It makes everyone hate it. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But yeah, so we need to bring things back to earth where people were taking the message and either misinterpreting it or only hearing the part that talks about the pump or the product dying, and then just blanket applying that to everything in the video. So let's get started. First one is going to be recapping some stuff. We're going to timestamp this video. It'll have time bars on the side and in the description. There will be sections where it's going to be repeating information in a slightly different way to try and help it stick a little bit better for the people who didn't quite understand it the first time. So if you feel like we're recapping something that you already got, you understood from the first time, feel free to just click a different, one of the other, well, you can't click it, but jump to another time bar topic. Okay, so there were a couple of really quick TLDRs that left out a lot of information, as they often do, and this ended up in a lot of people panicking from reading the TLDRs, but not really watching or fully understanding the content. We hit a really mainstream audience compared to our normal audience with that video, and you can really see it, because there's a lot of questions that are kind of like, it's a really mainstream audience is what I'm getting at. So basically, video was half an hour long. A lot of people didn't really watch it and then post their questions. And a lot of the TLDRs, it's kind of like playing a game of telephone where the first person gets a message, by the time it gets to the last person, it's completely different. And you're condensing thousands of words in a video into 10 words in a TLDR, and then the next person who posts that somewhere else condenses it into a few different words, and you end up with a scenario where it's like uploading a video to YouTube, downloading it, and uploading it again, and over time you get more and more corruption of the original data. So hopefully we can clear things up. Cavitation, first up. Some people asked about cavitation in the loop or suggested that maybe the pump failure that is experienced sometimes is, well, pump failure, people think it's pump failure, is caused by cavitation. People think that the air bubbles shown in the video, that's cavitation. So to be really clear, that's not cavitation. We said that in a comment at the top of the video, but didn't say it in the content itself. Cavitation will not happen with your AIO or your CLC, also known as a closed loop liquid cooler loop. It's just not going to. It's not powerful enough. Cavitation will happen in industrial grade pumps. It might happen in like a turbine for a hydroelectric plant or something like that, but not in a DIY hobbyist style motor that you're going to find in your CLC. So basically, in pumps and impellers, cavitation occurs when the pressure that is surrounding the impeller reduces to the extent that the water can get vaporized and cause these cavities or voids of gas to form. And when those voids pop against the impeller, it can cause damage. So that's cavitation. It's the vaporization of the liquid in the loop is sort of the TLDR version of that. So that's never going to happen in your computer liquid cooler. It's not powerful enough. It's not anywhere close to the level of power that's needed. So you need to look at an industrial application for this. What you're seeing in computer loops is just air. That's all it is. It's air that's in there, it's circulating. The coolers aren't completely filled with water. They have air in them, and they will develop more air over time by way of liquid leaving the loop through permeation and evaporation. But it is not cavitation that you're seeing when there's bubbles hitting the pump. Okay, custom loops. In the content, verbally and written on the screen, we made this point. You can skip it if you already know it. We said that you don't generally need to worry about custom loops for this discussion. So if you're concerned about this still, this is the question for you. In the content, we stated that it was really for AIOs and CLCs. I think that was stated in the description too. But the reason is custom loops. So one, with a custom loop, the pump is almost never going to be at the top of the loop. A lot of them have a reservoir on top of them, and then also just logistically, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's not really, the mounting locations don't work out like that. Pumps are almost never in the block for a custom loop. There are some out there like that, and then some of the same things would apply, except you also often have a large reservoir with a custom loop. Now, closed loops, AIOs, do have reservoirs as well. This is often overlooked, but the reservoir is the tank, and the tank is attached to either side of the radiator. So that's technically a res in a sense anyway, and that's technically a res in a sense. They're both very small though. With a custom loop, you're gonna have a much larger reservoir. The air will work its way to the top of that reservoir. It's probably not gonna come back down. There's a good volume of liquid in between the air and any form of suction or pressure whatsoever, so you're fine. Separately, custom loops do have more powerful impellers and pumps in them, and that's going to force through air bubbles much more effectively than in sort of a tiny AIO impeller system where it's just not that powerful. So you do not need to worry about with custom loops to the same degree. Radiator orientation, tube orientation matters for different reasons, but not for this one. It would mostly matter for things like where's it positioned in the case in terms of thermals, in terms of tube routing, but not because you need to be worried about the pump drying out for the same reasons you would in a CLC. Next one was a question from a lot of people saying, but if the tubes are down, the pump is up. So this question originated from people who got concerned that we were saying make sure the pump's not at the top of the loop, but also ideally you have your tubes, your barbs, at the bottom of the radiator orientation. And then the sort of feedback was, well, but Steve, if I put the tubes at the bottom, the barbs at the bottom, and flip my radiator 180 degrees, then the pump's at the top of the loop. That's not how it works. So I'm not trying to be condescending, just trying to like phrase it. So the pump is in the same place in the loop. All you've done is rotate your radiator 180 degrees or whatever the rotation was. So the radiator, again, it doesn't know really, in a sense, what part of it is up or down. But if the pump is located, let's say sort of centrally, this is a small rad, so it's kind of hard to demonstrate. Let's say it's located kind of centrally like that. Maybe that's your system. In this setup, the pump is not, it's tripping. My glue is not fully airtight. In this system, the pump is not at the top of the loop. This part of the rad is. So the radiator is still at the top. And if we flip it, then it's still the case that the pump's not at the top of the loop. The radiator is. So no, flipping it will not just make the pump be at the top of the loop, because it wasn't at the top of the loop before. It's not at the top of the loop now if the only thing you did was flip your radiator, because the radiator is still, some part of it is the top of the loop. This is just, air is going to rise to the surface in a closed loop system containing water unless there's some other mechanical factor at play that prevents this. Take a water bottle, right? I was trying to think of an example. You take a water bottle that you buy at the store and it's filled mostly to the top. It's filled about 90%, just like a lot of closed loop liquid coolers. They're 90 to 98% full of liquid. The air is resting on top. It's not like it's sort of bubbling around in the middle. It doesn't find its way to the bottom. If you flip the water bottle over, you'll see bubbles come up. Maybe we should film this. And then the air goes to that top. So just like flipping the water bottle over, the water and the air are just going to sort themselves out in the same orientation, regardless of how the container is configured. This is like, it's like Bill Nye level of really basic science. But again, we did reach a mainstream audience, and some people need that sort of parallel to something they see every day to have it click and make sense. And that's completely fine. We're happy to provide it. Let's move on to the next one. So this one is people panicking. Is my cooler orientation correct? It's super cool that people were actually really interested in this topic. I loved to see the response where people are like opening up their systems, they're looking at it, that people who bought pre-builts were messaging us saying, I've never worked on a computer, I bought this pre-built and it's oriented like this, what do I do? So that's awesome. Anyone who's in that camp, having never worked on a computer before you opened it up to try something out because of the previous video, thank you for telling us about that experience. That's a really cool way to get into your first hands-on with working on a computer. You can go from there and apply that to the rest of it. So good job on that. Also really cool to see the interest, people who care about how it's oriented. It was nice to see that it wasn't like falling on deaf ears like it has previously when we've said that. So all of that said, I should restate a few things here. There's one comment that said, but he didn't show the correct way to mount it. So we did. We had title cards in the bottom left of the video. I verbally said it when we got to the start of the experiment. The first one I showed, I said this is how you should have it. But to go over it again, because there were a lot of people who were like, well, but is this one correct, or is this slight different configuration that you're talking about correct? Things like that. So first of all, if your cooler is installed against the recommended use, it's not going to just explode overnight. It's not like the plastic's just melting down every second you're sitting there thinking about if you should flip it over or not. You can calm down and take a few minutes. If it's inconvenient for you to flip it over today or this week or this month, that's fine. Put it on your to-do list and do it next month. It's not going to explode overnight, most likely. That stated too, the biggest thing, again, that we said in the video is that the radiator at the bottom, pump up top, really pump at the top of any loop. You could do it front mounted, pump up top too. That is the dangerous one. That's the one that's going to cause immediate damage to the system. Not necessarily the impeller or the pump in a technical sense, but that's what people end up calling dead. They call the pump dead, even if it's magnetic levitation, doesn't need lubricate in the loop. But that's where you'll experience some sort of system failure or just really bad thermals creeping up over time. And even then, we're talking a time span of there's no real hard data that's out there publicly about it. We have some information from the suppliers, but it's sort of like increasing VSOC, the SoC voltage on a Ryzen CPU. If you increase it to 1.4, we know it's going to degrade the silicon quality over time, like the IMC, and reduce the maximum frequency minimum voltage you can sustain with whatever you're working on, memory for this example. So we know that's going to happen, but we don't have a hard timeline on when, just that it is a fact of doing that. Maybe it's 6 months, and commonly that's sort of the cited number for that example specifically. For these, if you install pump at the top, you might be talking, depending on the manufacturer, the generation of pump they're using, there's so many variables here, but you might be talking, say, 1 to 3 years of life rather than 5 or 6 plus if it's installed that way, because over time, that air will work its way into the pump plate. And even if you're filled to say 98%, like Asetek's target, rather than 90, which is one of the other suppliers' targets, you're still going to have air up there. And it's still going to cause efficiency problems. It's still going to increase the temperature of that housing where the plastic can only really sustain 60 degrees internal temperature. So over time, if you're losing efficiency on getting heat away from the CPU, what's it heating up? Well, if it's not heating up water, it's heating up plastic, and that's bad. So again, the biggest thing is don't put the pump on the top of the loop if you can avoid it. If you have to do it, like it's some weird, like it's a Fantex shift or something, there's not a lot of great solutions for that case, unless you can maybe get it on the sidewall or I guess flip it over or something. Not really sure that's the best idea either. So in that instance, maybe just live with it and roll the dice. You might come out fine. It might survive past the usable life of the system. Maybe it'll be limping along the way in the end, but it might be okay. We would strongly recommend not installing it that way for just about every reason. But if it's literally the only option and you already own the stuff, unless you have a good way to move the radiator around, there's no reason to feel anxiety over it if you can't do anything about it at this point. So you just let it go, and if it dies, then replace it. No big deal. It's maybe, if it takes 1 to 3 years, sure, you feel like you wasted money when it should have lasted 5, 6 plus, but it's probably not going to take any components out with it. It's just going to stop circulating water, and you'll have downclocking and things like that. CPUs are pretty good at protecting themselves. The point of all that is to try and reduce the panic level a bit. Again, pumps at the top, I would immediately change it if possible. But if I can't change it, I'm not going to go buy like a new case and a new cooler for that reason only. Next one, away from the issue of cooler death, which is definitely at some point going to happen sooner in most configurations of the pump at the top of the loop, but not always. Just it is a bit of a roll of the dice, depending on how long you're using it, how high it was filled, and what sort of temperatures you're putting through that loop. But that's mostly guaranteed to be a bad thing. Unlike that, though, tubes at the top, radiator at the front of your case, with the pump somewhere in the middle. This is a really common configuration. Like we said, the tubes often aren't long enough, so that's how it goes. This is primarily and foremost an acoustics issue, where anytime you hear like that bubbling noise, sometimes you'll hear a brief pump whine. That's often caused because of this. This is all a recap in the video. You can skip to the next one if you got all this the first time. So that doesn't mean it's going to die as fast as the pump at the top, radiator on the bottom. That's not at all what we were saying. We're saying it's mostly acoustic first. It is performance at some level, and you might experience accelerated permeation, but it's nothing anywhere near as bad as rad bottom, pump at the top of the loop. So if you absolutely cannot rotate the thing, then again, don't freak out about it. It's just you might be dealing with more noise throughout the life of the cooler. It will get worse as the cooler ages if you're going to use the system for a long time, and maybe you replace it a year, maybe 2 years earlier if you're going to use it for 5, 6 plus. But it's not as bad as the much shorter lifespan of the other configuration. As far as sources, other than the testing we've done and the experiment we showed, we did speak with several companies on and off record for their representation. So we spoke with Arctic's, one of their PMs, I think is his position. We spoke with Cooler Master. We spoke with Asetek in an official capacity. And then there were a couple of others that I'm not going to name or at least assign specifics of the conversations to, because in those other instances, I went to engineers at the companies and bypassed PR, which is generally frowned upon because the engineers aren't supposed to talk to media without supervision because they might say things that are bad for the company. So I can't name everyone, but I can at least give you big names that are important. Asetek, Arctic, and Cooler Master are certainly huge in the space. So all of them told us that they recommend against a bottom mount radiator pump up top, as seen in a lot of the ITX cases out there. This isn't us just saying, look, there's not enough water in the pump. You can see it in our experiment. It's companies that sell millions of these units who have RMA numbers, who have long-term thermal cycling testing, things like that. They're the ones saying don't install it this way. And in some cases, like EVGA, for example, has documents, and so does Cooler Master, where they explicitly strike through that orientation or the orientation, like tubes at the top and pump above that. Corsair actually also, in its manuals, will recommend tubes at the bottom of the radiator when it's front mounted or side mounted, as the case may be. So yeah, all of them were quick to condemn pump top, and most of them were quick to strongly recommend getting the tubes at the bottom when it's in a front mounted orientation, but they weren't saying, you know, it's like as bad as the other. One of the weirdest or maybe least informed comments we saw was something to the extent of like, well, but do you really think engineers would design something to be used this way if it's not going to work? The answer is, in a sense, yes. It's sort of begging the question, but it's not necessarily the engineers, because the engineers aren't taking those marketing photos. So this specific comment is relating to the NZXT and other product manufacturer images where they show their case with the cooler mounted in a way which is considered to be suboptimal and incorrect in many instances. So we see this fallacy a lot. It's really sort of frustrating to see where people say, well, but the engineers, they know what they're doing. One, they might not. They're not like infallible magic people. You know, the engineers in this industry, there's some really good ones and there's some new ones. But two, it's really not about the engineers. They probably know. The ones we spoke with at the companies I just named, they certainly know. They were so happy to get in on this content. They were like, yes, please make this content. So many people tell us about their pumps making noise from being tubes up, and people tell us about have RMAs because they put the pump at the top of the loop. So both of these things are things that cause us problems and cause us RMAs. Please tell the world, here's paragraphs of information. So it's not that engineers don't know, it's that marketing and 3D artists who are making the renders, they're the ones taking the photos. They're not making the product. So it's not about, well, but Steve, don't you trust the engineers? I mean, I might, depending on who it is, but do I trust marketing to show the product and use properly? So it comes down to communication things with the companies internally. Besides, if an engineer wrote the marketing materials for these products, they'd be filled with asterisks of like, well, technically we can't say it's the best because there is better stuff out there, but in a practical sense, we're within plus or minus X degrees and we can handle Y degrees per watt and our thermal resistance is X, Y, Z. That's what you get with engineers. So anyway, in general, the manufacturers with whom we spoke recommended against the tube's top, radiator front configuration, pump in the middle, because the air bubbles will get sucked through the barbs and hit the pump, create noise, acoustic issues, and over time, as your water level drops, it will in fact bring more air through the loop. You can experience accelerated permeation to a small degree, not as bad as some of the other configs we talked about, and you will likely experience some form of long-term performance fall off, long-term acoustic issues, and depending on the pump and the cooler, obviously, it depends on whose product you're using, and potentially even early failure of the unit if it's one that doesn't have quite as much water when it starts life and it's run under a thermally abusive scenario 24/7. We gave all of these examples in the first video. Finally, for this one topic, this question, there were a lot of people who sent us tweets of like their O11 dynamics, things like that, where they've got it oriented in one of the many ways we already described, except the radiator's on the side of the case instead of the front. So the cooler doesn't know whether it's front mounted or side mounted. It just knows, it knows in a sense, where the pump's located, where the tanks are located. So if you're asking, well, okay, but mine's like this, is that okay? If we said, and we did, this is okay, then, and it's hard to see here because of the length of that rad, but pump's in the middle. If we said this is okay, pump in the middle, tube's bottom, then also this is okay. Just to make that really clear, we had a lot of questions about that. So it's the same thing, it's just rotated 90 degrees. All right, now that I've remade that entire video, let's move on to the next point. Stop pestering YouTubers. Often YouTube reviews feature systems that are built for maybe a day or less. And as we said in the first video, we don't blame YouTubers or PC builders on subreddits and forums for orienting their coolers one way or another. This is an education issue that's largely falls on the shoulders of manufacturers and making sure that they properly document how to use their products in the optimal sense, and then they say whether it's okay to use it in XYZ suboptimal senses, but they should be offering this is an optimal use guideline, which is what we showed in that video. Tube's bottom, if it's front mounted, stuff like that. So the reason I brought this one up is because I tried to preempt this and prevent it in the first video by really early on saying like, this isn't like going after YouTubers, but people still, I don't know what it is. It's some weird psychological thing where they're like, I've learned a new thing. I need to go show someone else how smart I am and how they're wrong or something like that. So if you're on YouTube and you see someone post a video of like a system build and the radiator's in the front and the tubes are at the top, you don't need to like raid them about orientation of the cooler. So that wasn't really the intent of the topic. Next one, does it matter where tubes exit the pump block? This is a good question. I didn't make any comments on this in the video and probably should have, just to clarify. But some people said, you know, the pump block on the CPU, mine has the tubes coming out of the top of it, but yours, they're coming out of the side. Does that matter? The answer is no. So orientation of everything, all those considerations are the same, but that doesn't really matter now. Next one, hot air rising and thermals of front versus top mounts. So this question was, quote, is there any disadvantage with hot air rising when mounting a radiator to the top of the case? There's difference when you mount the radiators in different places of the case, but again, the radiator doesn't know what the front or the top is. What matters is the fan orientation. We'll get into that in a second. I want to address the hot air rising thing first. Hot air does indeed rise. But when you're talking about multiple 1,000 or 1,500 RPM or 200,000 RPM fans in a case, in a computer, plus whatever's on your GPU and your CPU, it doesn't matter that hot air rises because nothing's going to happen faster in that system than the air moving it forcefully. So hot air rising in a computer, in the sense of DIY enthusiast, like the type of stuff we all work with, it's basically irrelevant if you have fans in there anyway. Maybe a really slight difference at the top of the case if you could conduct some scientific, heavily controlled test, and then definitely a slight difference if the top of the case is completely just like ensconced in metal and glass and things like that. But for the most part, if there's holes in it somewhere, hot air rising becomes irrelevant as you start planting fans everywhere in the system. So that's not the reason there might be a disadvantage. If you top mount, this is the best way to think about it. If your radiator's in the front of the case and the fans are in front of the radiator, then those fans have access to room ambient temperature air. Let's say room ambient is about 21 degrees Celsius. So what is that, like 70 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. So now you take that system and you move it to the inside of the case where the air has been heated as it's come off of VRMs, come out of the video card, out of its fin stack, and scattered into the case. So now you might have a case ambient temperature where instead of 21, you're talking maybe 30 degrees Celsius for the air that's hitting the fan. So your baseline for the air going into the radiator is now higher. You cannot get below the temperature of the air going through the radiator. If the air going through the radiator is 30, your floor for water temperature is going to be 30. Probably plus a little bit too, because you've got some heat in the loop from at least the pump, if not the thing it's cooling. And if it's at the front, your floor is 21. So idle floor is going to be lower, and then probably the load floor is going to be lower if it's mounted in the front. Now, that said, this is actually completely irrelevant if you change where the intake is, because this is under the assumption that when you top mount, you're doing exhaust. You can top mount and do intake too, and then just be mindful of what your front fans are doing. Maybe you set them up to exhaust. It's not really ideal because in a lot of cases, well, it could be ideal, it depends on the case, but in a lot of cases, that means you're now pushing air through your dust filter on the front. Dust filter on the front's not really doing anything anymore, and into the room, which it's all going into the room anyway. The computer's literally just a space heater. That's all it is. It does a little bit, but pretty much everything turns into heat, so for the most part. So the difference is that it's coming out of the front, might be hitting you, it might be uncomfortable. So if your radiator's in the top and it's intake, it really, for the most part, it's going to be about the same as if it's in the front and it's intake, because it's just access to cold air that matters. Maybe your radiator body temperature is like a degree higher from proximity to the VRMs, but that's the answer to that one. Yes, it will be warmer if it's top mounted and exhaust in most instances. Does that matter? Well, not really. A couple degrees isn't going to make a world of difference. What will make a world of difference, though, is like acoustic annoyances from being improperly mounted in the front, and potentially longevity to a lesser degree than if it's pump at the top of the loop to really drive that point in, but potentially longevity, definitely acoustics, stuff like that. So the only reason you should care about a couple degrees is if you're chasing higher overclocks and it's your threshold for the highest single core delta, core-to-core delta is the highest core is, you know, that extra couple degrees would bring you down below TJ max. Okay, that pretty much recaps the main questions. There was one that was something like, but how is it wrong if you can install it that way? That was a really strange question. It basically said, this is where I was talking about we're getting a mainstream viewer base for that video. The question was something to the extent, I don't think I saved it, but I can fit it that way, so how is it wrong? I mean, you know, I can fit an AMD CPU into an Intel socket, and I can close the lid and everything for the most part, but it's still wrong. So that just because you can install something a certain way doesn't mean that it should be installed that way. But anyway, hopefully that addresses all the questions. I'm sorry to recap so much of the content. I know I repeated a lot of things. I know that's annoying to our regular viewers, but we hit such a wide audience on this last one that I was looking at the viewer retention graph, and you can tell where we're hitting that mainstream audience because it's a lot lower after the maybe 8-9 minute mark than it typically is, but the views are way higher. And then there's this huge spike at the end for the conclusion that we don't normally see quite to that degree. So this tells me that there's a lot of people in there, and it's evidenced by the comments I saw that I didn't include this, where they're like, what's the short version for those of us with the shorter attention span? Was almost word for word one of the comments. And, you know, that's just, I mean, that's fine, but it's not really the audience I cater to. So in that sense, this video won't help, will it? Anyway, that's it for this one. At least they can jump to well, we had timestamps in the last one too, so I don't know. Huh. I've compounded my problem instead of fixing it. That's it for this one. Subscribe for more as always. If you want the Patreon episode, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to get that, or store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a mod mat, a mouse mat, or similar items. The medium mod mats are in stock and shipping now, as are the wireframe mouse mats. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.